Adrian Elrod, we're going to be talking about the Joe Biden story a little bit later on. There's a lot of developments there. But in terms of President Trump's attempts here to own the narrative, how is he lining up against Joe Biden in terms of approach to coronavirus? Are Americans responding to that?
They're not, Mika. And this is one of the reasons why you're seeing independent voters swing toward Joe Biden, suburban swing voters swing toward Joe Biden. That is exactly, Mika, why you're seeing Texas tied right now. Donald Trump and Joe Biden tied in Texas. That is monumental, especially 6 months out before the election. Americans are losing trust and confidence that Trump can handle this pandemic. And they are worried about the economy. I mean, we're seeing millions and millions of Americans file for unemployment every single week. Unfortunately, I don't see this trajectory ending anytime soon. I don't think any of us do. And that is exactly why you're seeing voters in the Dallas suburbs, the Houston suburbs, San Antonio suburbs. There's a lot of suburban voters in Texas. And that is why you're seeing this swing. Of course, we're also seeing a tie in North Carolina. Joe Biden is leading in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, key crucial states. And then, of course, Florida, which is Joe Biden's a couple of points up in Florida. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Donald Trump is also losing support among older white voters who really helped propel him in 2016.
You know, John Heilemann, few would have guessed this even a month ago, even with this pandemic raging, because I think few people expected the president to continue to mishandle this crisis as much as he did. But you have Joe Biden and Donald Trump tied in Georgia, Joe Biden and Donald Trump tied in Texas, Donald Trump losing to Biden in North Carolina, losing to Biden in Florida, losing badly to Biden in Pennsylvania, losing to Biden in Michigan, losing to Biden in just about every swing state. What does Biden do moving forward? What does I would ask, what does Donald Trump do moving forward? But again, he doesn't seem to be able to control himself at all. And I'm just wondering, here we are in May, and a lot of people would say, well, it's way too early. But I still remember the 2012 story you wrote about how Barack Obama defined Mitt Romney in such a way in May that Romney never recovered from it.
Right. You know, you go back and talk, Joe, to people who have been at the core of incumbent reelection campaigns, White House political directors and campaign managers in re-elections, right? So Obama in 12, Bush in 04, Clinton in 1996, just the last three presidents in our lifetime, right? All of them will tell you that all three of those races in those re-elects had presidents who were struggling in various ways. They were a little bit below 50% or maybe a little bit more than below 50% in their approval ratings. All of them were deeply concerned about their boss's ability to win. All of them ended up winning close races, but not blowout in 1996 with Clinton, a very close race with Bush in 2004, and a close to a blowout with Obama and Romney in 2012. What all of them say is that the biggest misunderstanding that we all have, even people who are sophisticated about politics, is that we think that the campaign is fought in the fall. And what they all say is that for their bosses, when they won re-election in the spring. That Bill Clinton defining Bob Dole in the spring of 1996 is what won the race for Bill Clinton. That George W. Bush defining John Kerry in the spring of 2004 is what won the re-election for George W. Bush. And definitely the thing you just mentioned, the job that the Obama people did defining Mitt Romney in the spring of 2012. The races in all of those incumbent re-elects were determined by what happened in the spring. The state of the country, the arguments that were made by incumbents who turned the race from a referendum on them into a choice between them and an opponent that they rendered unacceptable in the public eye. So now we come forward to 2020. We are in that spring again, and what you're seeing in the polls that you just cited across the board on the fundamental issue that's going to face these two candidates in this fall, the question of the coronavirus and President Trump's handling of it, is the race is slipping away from Donald Trump. I'm not trying to say he can't win. I'm just trying to say that if history is a guide, this race is being determined right now, not after Labor Day. It's being determined now. And if that's true and that pattern holds, then the president's people should be deeply concerned about what's happening right now, because views of him with respect to this central issue are hardening right now. And the Biden campaign isn't even having to do very much to make it happen. That's a really worrying situation for President Trump.
All right, we're going to have much more ahead on that sweeping Washington Post analysis. What exactly did those internal poll numbers show that had the president reportedly erupt in anger at his campaign manager? One of the reporters for the piece, Bob Costa, will be our guest.
Is that where he threatened to sue Brad?
Yeah, poor Brad Parscale.
Poor Brad. I mean, come on.
Plus, by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans give far better marks to the way governors are handling the crisis versus the president. We'll talk to one of those state leaders when Republican Mike DeWine of Ohio joins the conversation. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.